Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Last week offered a few developments and stories we've been examining on this program. Lawmakers met to discuss more funding for victims of Hurricane Helene, and there was a new decision in the legal battle over ballots in a North Carolina Supreme Court race. WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran has been covering these stories, and he joins us now by phone. Will, welcome back.
Good to talk to you again.
Will, I want to start with the Supreme Court race, and before we get into it, I should probably remind listeners that these are fast-moving stories, so for the latest developments, check out the latest at WRAL.com. Now, Will, on Friday, we had the first state court hearing and ruling in the legal battle that could decide a seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. It was a whirlwind day. Set the scene for us.
Yes, this case is ping-ponged back and forth between federal and state courts, but for now, it at least is pretty solidly in state court and went to trial, or at least a hearing in Wake County Superior Court. And hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. I got there an hour early. There were already 100 plus protesters crammed into the tiny little hallway outside this courtroom that holds about 20 people. And then just as the day went on, even more people started pouring in. You know, the bailiffs had to come multiple times, tell people to, talk more quietly because there's other trials going on. But it was just this sort of, just outpouring of opposition, really, from people who are opposed to this idea of throwing out 60,000 plus ballots. And that was just inside the courtroom. Outside the courtroom, there were also more active protests with signs and things like that, and there were more anti-Griffin protesters outside. There were also about a dozen pro-Griffin protesters outside, organized by the state Republican Party. The state Republican Party chairman, Jason Simmons, was there himself. And so, you have this kind of show of support and opposition, on the sidewalks outside in downtown Raleigh, in the hallways, and then in the courtroom itself. Both Allison Riggs and Jefferson Griffin were there. And I'm sure this is probably the first time either of them has seen each other since, probably, one of the candidate forums they did, maybe back in September or October before the election. And this is actually the first time that any of us reporters had seen Griffin in public since the election. Allison Riggs has been in several court hearings previously, but Griffin so far has not shown up, except he did come for Friday's hearing.
Now, just real quick, just remind us again, what is the case and what were their arguments on Friday?
So this is the case for the state Supreme Court race. Allison Riggs, the incumbent Democratic justice, appears to have won by about 700 plus votes over Griffin, who is a Republican judge on the State Court of Appeals. But even though we've had some recounts confirm that, Griffin is challenging 60,000 voters' ballots and wants to have them thrown out for various reasons. He says that either the voters broke the rules or should have been deemed ineligible to vote. Now, the State Board of Elections has already rejected those arguments. After they rejected those arguments, he sued the State Board of Elections, arguing that they made the wrong decision and that his case should be heard. And that was the case that was in Wake County Court. And on Friday, a few hours after court ended, the judge ruled against Griffin. He ruled that the Elections Board didn't do anything wrong when it voted to reject his protests. And so, we heard just immediate, celebration from Allison Riggs, who, obviously would like for this to be over. She has called repeatedly on Griffin to concede the race, stop this legal battle. But we heard from the state GOP that Griffin is likely to appeal. This is obviously, as you mentioned in the intro to this podcast, a fast-moving thing. It could be by the time that people are listening to this podcast, he will have already appealed. But that could be coming anytime if it hasn't already in the coming days. And so we fully expect to see this continue in state courts. This battle is not yet over, but for right now, we do at least have the Wake County trial court weighing in, saying that the Board of Elections didn't do anything wrong when it rejected Griffin's challenges.
Now, this is already kind of getting political. If you look at the political affiliations of the judges, the trial court judge is a Democrat. If he were to appeal, say, to the Court of Appeals, that's largely Republican. Beyond that, can you just kind of walk us through the dynamics of that?
Yes. I mentioned earlier how this has gone back and forth between federal and state courts. And that is because Griffin has wanted to keep this in state court. And the Elections Board and Riggs have wanted this to be in federal court. And like you mentioned, Republicans have strong majorities on both the state Court of Appeals and also the state Supreme Court. So Griffin feels better with his chances if this case stays in state courts.
And those judges and justices have largely ruled in the direction that Republicans might want them to, right?
Yes, we've seen in recent years under both Democratic majorities on the state Supreme Court and Republican majority that currently exists on the state Supreme Court, especially in political cases, the rulings tend to come down along partisan lines based on whichever party controls the court. That's just kind of the reality that we have here in North Carolina. We elect our judges in partisan elections, and we get, partisan politicians on the court. That's not always apparent in the business cases, the criminal cases. You don't always see pure party line decisions in those types of cases. But when it's something that deals with gerrymandering, election law, voter ID, any sort of political issue like that, at least in the last 5+ years, it has just been pretty purely political rulings from the court. And so it's a little bit different this time, actually. It's a little bit more complicated at the Supreme Court because one of the Republican justices on the court, Justice Richard Dietz, has been very clear in some previous rulings in this case that he is going to be ruling against Griffin. He has said that there might be some merit to some of the challenges that Griffin has been proposing, but that it doesn't matter because these people already voted. These votes were already counted. He says that we can't just go back and undo it and retroactively say, oh, sorry, your votes don't count, even though you didn't know that you were breaking the rules. He says that's just not how things should operate. So Justice Riggs has recused herself from this case. So there are 6 justices who will be voting on this if it comes to the Supreme Court, when it comes to the state Supreme Court. And we know that there are at least 2, because we've seen previous dissents, who are against Griffin's arguments. That's Dietz and also the other Democrat who's still on the court, Justice Nina Earls. That leaves 4 other Republicans left who haven't really made their position quite as clear. Some of them have indicated that they're maybe leaning towards ruling in favor of Griffin eventually, but none of those other 4 Republicans have been quite as explicit. So, there's a possibility that we could even have a 3-3 tie at the state Supreme Court. And if that happens, then it would just be the case of whatever the previous ruling has been in the case would stand. However, this could also bounce back to federal court, like the Elections Board and the Riggs campaign have been asking for. And actually, recently, when we saw a federal court put this case back into state court, it also put in that ruling essentially saying that we are going to hold on to our ability to take this back into federal courts later if we think that state courts don't handle it entirely properly. So that's a very long-winded way of me to say this is far from over. We still have no idea what the end result is going to be, or even who is going to be in charge of handing down the final decision whenever that might come.
What are you going to be watching for this week, though?
Well, this week we could see the appeal from Griffin's team. Even though this is so far dragged on for, it's 3 months after the election now, and like I said, this legal fight is really still in its infant stages. Everyone wants this to move fast. People don't agree on a lot in this case, but all the sides want this to move very fast because it's important. This is a race for a seat on the state Supreme Court. We need to know who the real justice for that seat is. While this has been going on, Riggs has been allowed to continue serving in that role. There's a rule in the state constitution that essentially says that is how issues like this will be handled. And Griffin has continued serving in his role on the Court of Appeals. But we need clarity, and everyone agrees with that. All the parties involved, all the judges involved. So this is moving much, much more quickly than really any other court case would ever move.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear where North Carolina lawmakers stand on a plan for more relief funding for Hurricane Helene victims. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporter Will Doran about Hurricane Helene recovery efforts. Will, we mentioned recently on this program that state lawmakers were planning more funding for Helene victims. They came back last week. What did they propose?
Yes, they have proposed $500 million in what they deem part one of the 2025 efforts for Helene relief. And, I should note that this is the House version of the bill. We expect to see probably something different from the Senate. The Senate has not actually made their own proposal public yet, but the House is pushing forward with a $500 million bill that would the exact details actually aren't all there yet. They're looking at spending about 80% of that on rebuilding homes, helping farmers, clear their fields and, get their farms back up and running, and then also helping repair private roads and bridges throughout that part of the state that, wouldn't normally be covered by taxpayer spending.
Now, their number differs from what Governor Josh Stein wants, right?
Yes, this House plan is not even half of what Governor Josh Stein recently said is needed for immediate funding. He laid out a $1.1 billion plan that he says needs urgent approval from the state legislature. We heard from the House sponsor of this bill, Representative John Bell, pretty high-ranking Republican, that they came up with their own $500 million number after talks with both Stein's office and with state Senate leadership. So, while that's not explicitly saying it, I think that's a pretty clear indication that, Stein's billion-dollar-plus plan does not have a chance of passing the legislature, and that the House thinks that maybe $500 million is a little bit more reasonable, at least for right now. As we talk about this, the state also has a budget that we need to write this year, and that will probably, if history is any guide, not become law until late summer, maybe early fall. And so that is why, you hear Stein and you hear Republicans as well talking about, okay, we need to do something now. We need to do something immediately, part one. And so there could be more money set aside for Helene relief in the state budget several months from now, half a year from now. But as far as what we're going to do now, that's a separate question. And that is what is moving forward in the House right now. It doesn't appear that Stein's full plan has support in the legislature, but there are some things that Stein and Republicans do seem to agree on, at least the Republicans in the House. Like I said,
what are those? Yeah.
We haven't heard as much from the Senate, but Stein and House leadership have the exact same number for rebuilding homes, and it's a lot, $150 million immediately to kickstart home rebuilding, and that's on top of anything that FEMA will be putting into it later. The FEMA process, just as we've learned from very slow responses to Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, can take a long time. So the idea of spending extra state money is just to, okay, let's avoid the delays that have been well documented in North Carolina after those previous hurricanes. Let's kick in some more money now, get those homes rebuilt for folks out there as quickly as possible, and then FEMA can come in later and put in however much money they're able to as well. And so that is a shared goal from everyone. Everyone seems to also support the idea of rebuilding some private roads, rebuilding farms. The legislature wants to actually spend more on that than Stein does, although Stein does propose spending some on it. Stein wants to spend a lot of money on small business grants, and that is something that the legislature so far just does not seem to favor. This would be maybe something similar to the PPP program during COVID, or things of that nature to just help businesses in Western North Carolina, which is heavily tourism dependent, stay afloat, because obviously in the aftermath of a hurricane, visits are going to go down. You're not going to have as much tourism, and so places like river guides and restaurants and all sorts of things might be struggling right now. And Stein says we need to give these folks grants. Republicans opposed that idea when Governor Cooper proposed it several months ago. They've seemed to have opposed it again now that it's coming from Stein. They think if any money is going to go to businesses out there, it needs to be in the form of loans and not grants. So that is going to be a continued political fight. But in the meantime, there is no money set aside for that, except for a small program that Stein has set up with some private funding, but to try to get that kickstarted. But that public-private partnership that Governor Stein's working on is smaller, much smaller than what he says the state needs to kick in as well.
Well, we expect the issue to come up again this week. What are you going to be watching for?
Yes. So like I mentioned, the House has their $500 million plan. It was pretty vague. They said, okay, they laid out 7 different types of relief, basically categories. And they said, okay, we're going to spend, $150 million here, $100 million here, $60 million here, et cetera. But it was just those big, broad numbers, big pots of money. There was no actual details. And so what the chairman of the committee asked all the committee members to do, this is a special Helene-focused committee that the legislature has set up, is to come back with recommendations on how to actually divvy up that money. And so those recommendations are all due by Monday. So we'll be watching those, and then that committee is going to meet again on Tuesday to essentially vote on, okay, which are the good ideas, which one should we approve, which one should we not approve. That's expected to pass through on Tuesday and then go to another committee Wednesday. So the House really does look like they want to move this quickly. Like I mentioned earlier, the Senate is moving more slowly. So it's anyone's guess right now whether or not the Senate will agree to pass a House bill that gets to it pretty quickly, or if they'll kind of slow walk things as they take a little bit longer examining exactly what they want to do. We don't know yet, but it does at least look like the House is moving pretty quickly on this one.
Going to be another busy week for the NC Capitol team. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran for his in-depth reporting on the state Supreme Court race and Hurricane Helene funding. Go to the NC Capitol section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.